Welcome to Frontier, an investment podcast by Foresight, where we discuss strategies, trends, and challenges shaping private market funds. Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the Foresight Frontier podcast with myself, Dan Wells, and my co-host Chris Holmes, both of us partners at Foresight Group. Today we are recording a very special episode, which is a breakdown, a run through of the Foresight Frontier Forum that we recently hosted, the world famous Eden project in Cornwall. Chris, it was a few weeks ago now that we had the Frontier Forum. Memory still fresh in your mind? Discussion there?
Still very fresh, Dan. I think it was such a wonderful occasion that it's still sticking in my memory of the fantastic forum that we had there. Thank you to the Eden Project for hosting us, but also a great collaboration and the guests that we had at that forum, and really interesting debates, discussions of which no doubt we'll draw out in this very special podcast, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So we were tackling a particular question at the Frontier Forum, which was how do we mobilise capital at scale into sustainable infrastructure and nature by 2030. So it's a big chunky subject, but something that is very important and relevant to everything we're doing here at Foresight. In this special episode of the Frontier podcast, we are very delighted to have two guests, Laura Sands and Juliet Rose, who will help us to delve into the takeaways from the forum. We're going to be exploring how Europe is navigating the energy transition, how we're decarbonising beyond the power sector, and how we're unlocking the potential of natural capital. And through these themes, our guests will unpack Europe's strategic priorities, policy opportunities, and investment pathways for a sustainable, competitive, and secure future. So there's lots to be getting on into, Chris, here. So I'm delighted to welcome, first of all, Laura Sands, CBE, who is a non-executive director at SEC Transmission. In terms of Laura's background, she specialises in the energy, food and resource sectors. She focuses on energy markets, digitalisation, food security and resource management. She's a former MP and has done millions of other things, which I can't list here because it would just take the entire episode to give her full background. So welcome, Laura. And we're also delighted today to be joined by Dr. Juliet Rose, Head of Development at Eden, one of our great friends at the Eden Project. In terms of Juliet's background, she began working for the Eden Project prior to its opening in 2001. She has a background in plant science, horticulture, and strategic environmental management planning for degraded land. During her time at Eden, Juliet has developed a variety of projects, including overseas conservation, creative community engagement, community-led planning, and regeneration. Her current role includes the development of Eden outreach programs, the National Wildflower Centre, and Eden International projects. So welcome, Juliet, and welcome, Laura. We're going to jump straight in there. Laura, I'm going to ask you a quick fire question to get things going. How do we mobilise capital at scale into sustainable infrastructure by 2030?
Well, I think we need to start with a plan, and I think that there is a plan now in place. And that plan is starting to enhance itself around last week, the National Energy System Operator announced Clean Power 2030, which gives a very strong strategic plan the government will respond to quite shortly. But also, in a much more sort of ambitious way, Keir Starmer has been announcing at COP that the UK economy will decarbonise by 81% by 2035. And that is a big target and actually takes us quite a bit beyond the energy sector itself and into what you might call the heavier lifting of decarbonisation.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was it was such an important announcement to hear that, and it's great to hear the leadership that the UK is obviously continuing to take in kind of climate worlds. Obviously, we've had big news in the last couple of weeks with the results of the US election, and that's going to obviously throw up a lot of questions in terms of how the US will engage in climate and energy circles in the coming months and years ahead. But good to see a bit of leadership being taken from the UK. And Juliet, from your perspective, any gut feelings on how we mobilise capital at scale into nature by 2030?
Well, that's a really interesting one, Dan. I think there's lots of things driving more interest in this. I mean, partly because we're seeing companies beginning to try and quantify some of the risks that they're facing. They're worrying about their resilience. They are starting to worry about climate change. We're seeing more companies signing up for things like task force on nature-related disclosures. They're very much trying to quantify what their impact is and then how they respond to that. The challenge is really that how do they respond to that part of that for themselves in trying to understand how they match their impact with the appropriate response to that, but also in the opportunities that are available for them to do so, and then how they make their claims for that at the end of the year against what everyone else is doing. So there's some interesting drivers, but there's still some interesting challenges, and we've still got, but I think, huge potential to create some opportunities for investment still. I mean, we know we've got this huge biodiversity funding gap, but that in itself is quite nuanced. That we want to encourage this investment into, and it's not all just about nature recovery. It's not all just about conservation, creation, and protection. There's also great opportunities around things like regenerative agriculture, things like biotechnologies, this kind of wider portfolio of opportunities that all do support biodiversities in very different ways, but they do support it. And I think it's really about us harnessing that whole picture, not just kind of siloed segments of that, and being able to offer that into the market.
As you say, Juliet, some huge opportunities there, which is really encouraging, and I think we can certainly come on to some of those in a little bit more detail as we go through the podcast. We have a few themes that we wanted to cover on the pod today. The first one being around energy transition, and indeed we kicked off our Frontier Forum, if you can remember, a few weeks ago. On this particular topic, we had an update from Nicholas Sundström, who's partner at Worthwhile Capital, giving us a very good précis of the Draghi report, which was all the 400 pages. I don't think many people sitting in that room had actually read through all 400 pages, but Nicholas assured us that he had, which was fantastic to hear his reflections. And really, it came down to summarising that Europe is really finding itself at a critical juncture, it's facing this trilemma of balancing growth, environmental sustainability, and security. And really, there's this call for that Draghi sets out in his report around urgency and specificity, really thinking about practical and impactful solutions. So, really coming to the heart of what we want to discuss around mobilising capital at scale. How are we going to do that? Not just thinking about it, not just the intellectual side of things. So really certainly set the scene very well at the forum. And I really think this is a great topic to dive into on the podcast, and really interested to hear your views, perhaps Laura, initially on how we can really sort of close this innovation gap in areas like clean energy and transportation, maintaining that competitive advantage that Draghi refers to in this report.
I mean, I think the Draghi report is very, very important for the overall system design and how we're going to actually collaborate. I mean, UK people collaborating with Europe, but a pan-European plan makes a significant difference. There have been lots of silos that have been emerging in different parts of Europe. And I mean, let's not forget that, it was only last week where we had these massive floods in Spain. So the urgency is there. If one starts to look at the prosperity side, I hope when we start to look at Germany in particular, and we're looking at the whole car manufacturing, that they understand that it isn't about retrenching back to a coal-based system, that they really do have to lean into a renewable system, and that will be actually the future of the economy when going forward. I mean, I think we've got to also recognise that China will be the first electro state as such, and that dynamic requires us to be competitive when it comes to renewables. So the most amount of effort that we can get from the EU, from each of the member states, and the UK, most certainly doing quite a bit of leadership in this, will actually make Europe a much more secure, prosperous, and, to be frank, resilient continent as we go forward. And if we don't, we're going to find ourselves in quite a lot of economic trouble. So how does one get the right mechanisms in place that actually unlocks the Draghi vision? And that is something that the banking sector, but also the regulators across Europe really need to lean into.
Well, I think that's a really important point you just made there, Laura. I think what we've seen in terms of the evolution of kind of European policy is maybe 2 or 3 years ago when Europe was first focusing on things like the Green Deal Industrial Plan and starting to support renewable energy, a bit of a response to the US Inflation Reduction Act. We saw those kind of policies further galvanized in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, when energy security was suddenly put alongside decarbonisation as being a top priority. But like you say, this most recent phase of climate policy in Europe, really putting this notion of competitiveness, really intertwining it with clean energy. But clean energy absolutely underpins Europe's competitiveness kind of going forward. Now then, how do you then kind of practically this policy, or how does this policy start to push the energy transition further? I think what it does is it well recognises some of the barriers, some of the bottlenecks of the energy transition right now. The key words, Nicholas Sundström, who gave the keynote speech, who Chris referred to, the key words he was picking up coming from European policymakers at the minute are grids, interconnectors and storage. And those are critical areas of investment to eliminate bottlenecks to the energy transition. And I guess from our perspective, we would really hope to see kind of more evolution of policy tools to help us. We have things like the Europe in the EU, the Project of Common Interest, or PCI status, is a really helpful piece of policy in terms of targeting specific key energy infrastructure projects that require support. We've seen in the last few weeks further announcements from the UK on support for long duration energy storage as well. So I think all these kind of specific areas are really adding specific kind of practical pieces of policy, are adding to this kind of general backdrop of the favourable mood music for climate policy in Europe.
I mean, I think there is something that we did get the sequencing wrong, and we started building all these wind farms and we forgot to build what I would call the motorways to link, i.e. transmission. We've then got enormous amount of bottlenecks on distribution grids, actually not for the energy sector, but for the industrial sector, who's now, from what I understand in the UK, there's about £3.5 billion worth of investment in industrial and commercial, from industrial and commercial companies that can't get connections. So our lack of grid capacity right across the board is actually becoming a real barrier to growth as well as to renewables. On the storage side, a big excitement for me, because I see it as one of the most important components. It's like refrigeration in the food sector. It's absolutely crucial. So the long duration storage, maybe the frozen food of the energy sector, is an important component, and the cap and floor will certainly help. But I do think that we've got a need for all sorts of storage right the way across the whole system. And that's going to be important for whether it be EV cars. If you think by 2035, the number of EV cars in the UK will be the equivalent of 3 nuclear power stations. So either they're going to require 3 nuclear power stations to fuel them, or they're going to be part of the system and actually deliver flexibility and storage that we need. So it's an exciting moment, but we have to really lean into this, because otherwise we're going to have a lot of curtailed energy. We're not going to unlock the flexibility that we need, and we're going to end up with a very expensive system all round.
Those are absolutely very well made points, Laura. And I think, just reflecting on the need to bring the private capital into grid is absolutely essential. Otherwise, all this effort around building out renewable energy generation is wasted. Had a very interesting podcast on interconnectors, you listened to, and that really did bring it home to me how important that connectivity is. It does provide that element of energy security with your, utilising neighbourly relations in a way, connect areas of high generation with those with high demand, even if that is at different times of the day. And I think I think front and centre to your strategy for our energy transition fund is around removing these bottlenecks, thinking about grid and storage. As Laura said, the frozen food, the energy system. I don't think I've heard it referred to as that, but perhaps we should pick that up in our IC papers. But I mean, your reflections on, particularly on the grid, I think that's the important aspect here, particularly when we're looking to scale up infrastructure by 2030.
Exactly, that's exactly right, Chris. And as you hear, people increasingly say there is no transition without transmission. So that I think the grid is fundamentally recognised as a key challenge now. Just to put one stat on it, we need to build a grid that is 111 million kilometres long by 2050. Which, if you're so inclined in terms of stats, that is 3/4 of the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So it's a lot of building we have to do. These investments are notoriously difficult to get through kind of planning and permitting systems. Also, there is just the challenge of getting private sector capital mobilised into these assets when typically energy system operators control the expenditure into these areas. But that's why it is great to see a continued kind of evolution in the landscape. Things like the EU Grid Action Plan recognise these kind of challenges. And certainly from a Foresight point of view, we'll keep advocating for the role of private sector capital going into the grid itself.
Can I just intervene here a little bit? Because I think also, if one is excited about investing in the transition, and let's leave the word energy out of this a little bit, one of the big challenges for transmission and for the whole of the energy sector is actually the supply chain. And while you're very focused and everyone's very focused on the energy asset, actually one of the major barriers is the supply chain. And we really do need investment and de-risking onshoring manufacturing here. And I actually think that that's a category that people aren't looking at the moment, but actually should start to look at, because it's going to be a massive, huge market that's starved of supply chain at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think supply chain is probably not something we were thinking about so much 3 years ago, but it's sort of coming out of COVID, it's just become absolutely critical.
Let's pivot to another theme that we picked up on at the Frontier Forum, and one that Juliet is very close to, around natural capital, nature-based solutions. Juliet, you obviously mentioned in your opening few comments there some of the challenges, but the huge opportunity we have to invest more into nature, but also recognising the importance of it. So really, a significant portion of the global economy, something like 55% of GDP, depends on nature. And really, we were really interested in highlighting at our forum the risks that nature loss can stress to societies and economic stability. But of course, there's challenges there to recognise the investment opportunity, not for it to be seen as a financial risk, but really one that can add to the human life, but also to our economy, and thinking about it perhaps in a different context. And be really interested, Juliet, to hear your reflections on that, perhaps casting your mind back to the Frontier Forum and some of the takeaways you had from the conversations we had there.
Yes, Chris, we had some very interesting discussions, didn't we, around the role of nature and how nature is perceived. Particularly, I think there is this growing, obviously I've said at the beginning, this kind of growing recognition about how the role of nature in business resilience, in its operational efficiencies, and whether or not actually they're going to be able to access capital in the future. I think it's going to eventually affect people's brand reputations. And I think ultimately there will also be points of compliance that they will have to adhere to. We did also, I think, talk about the fact that in the future, directors of companies are going to be much more accountable now for the way in which their companies are having an impact than they are at the moment, and they just need to be ahead of that. Don't wait to be told to get ahead of that, and find the opportunities to show that your company is doing the best things that it could do. There was a bit of discussion also about this recognition of supply chain. You will not be able to function in the future unless you do something about that now. And also, we did talk a little bit about what kind of stronger policy measures might be needed in order to kind of concrete some of that in, both as an incentive, but also, potentially as a deterrent as well. So there was lots of chat about that. I think we talked about confidence, didn't we? And we talked about this tension between the risk of investing, but also the risk of not doing something. And that came through. And I think we've still, the challenge is really convincing the markets that the risk of not doing something is still much bigger than the risk of investing at the moment. So I think those kind of things really emerge for me. And then ultimately this role of nature positive leadership. How do we grow those decision makers? How do we support them? How do we grow them? How do we incentivize them to make the decisions that we want them to make around investing in nature? And where does that come from? So is it coming from the NGO sector? Is it coming from government? Is it coming from within the sector itself? Probably from all of those places. But I think that's one of the things that we have to tackle in the future.
I think that's right, Juliet. It's turning the threat of nature loss into business opportunity, isn't it? And really encouraging that positive action, that long-term planning. I mean, your comments there around compliance, something we're very alive to here at Foresight. Perhaps you have some views on that and some of the activities we're putting into place around nature and our approach to it.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I think nature is one of those areas where there is now a really strong and growing investor interest in the area. We hear a lot more investors talking about having an appetite to invest in what they might call nature-based solutions or natural capital, having actual allocations to the area as well. So increasingly putting percentages of their AUM towards nature-based solutions. There is clearly a long way to go just in terms of people on the journey and understanding what the risk profile of these assets look like. And just picking up on your point, Juliet, we had really interesting discussions at the forum about exactly this. Investors kind of saying, how do I price the risk of nature? And the kind of counterpoint being, how do you price the risk of not investing in nature was very well made. I guess from our perspective, from a kind of foresight natural capital perspective, we obviously start with the kind of fundamentals of what is a good investment program that is also contributing to sustainability objectives. Our activities in natural capital are very much focused on kind of forestry at the core, so as in afforestation, reforestation, so actively growing forests and developing forests, and then building the other kind of natural capital work and interventions around that. So things like restoring the soil, restoring peatlands, possibly in future ocean-based solutions, but kind of going about it from that perspective. So having a really good kind of solid real asset investment strategy at the heart and kind of building beyond that. There is obviously recognition from investors that things like carbon credits, different forms of environmental commodities will be really important parts of the overall revenue stack in the future. But in some respects, these are still kind of nascent areas.
Juliet, you mentioned there the sort of the multiple stakeholders involved in this very important aspect of our economy, and I'm interested to hear a little bit more about the Eden Project's experience, particularly with public-private partnerships and your engagement with external stakeholders, how they have helped you and some of the challenges you're perhaps still facing in the role that you have.
Yeah, I mean, that builds on, I think, one of the things that emerged from the forum as well was this idea of blending things, blending opportunities, but also blending the partnerships to enable to deliver those blended opportunities. But I mean, in order to deliver this natural capital at scale, we are going to need lots of different skills to put it into practice. So we're on the scale that we're doing at, obviously we're using science partners, we're using government partners, we're using private partners as well to deliver. Ultimately, what we want to be is a really high integrity product. That's what you need. You can't do that all on your own. You have to do that by reaching out to people and using the skills as and when you need them. So I think that's going to be really important in the future as well. And I think the other thing that is really interesting that's going to play a big part in this is the role of technology too. So that we know that new technologies are coming online that provide investment opportunities. We're seeing some really interesting, we're seeing a lot of interest, particularly from young venture capitalists in that space, particularly around biotechnologies, but also it's going to play a really important role in the kind of monitoring and verification and therefore the confidence in investment as well. So that's been our approach, is to embrace technology, embrace partnerships, bringing the skills where you need them, and then kind of put it all together. I think this is not a case of, one person having a good idea sitting in a room on their own. That's not going to work. This is all about collaboration in order to deliver, as I say, the best possible nature-based product that we can provide.
Yeah, Juliet, you guys have been doing such important work here for such a long time, and you're such pioneers in the space. It must be good to see the rest of the world kind of catching up. And certainly one thing we're kind of aware of here, and actually Nicholas picked this up in his keynote address, was the EU nature restoration laws that have come in this year, which for the first time put binding restoration targets on EU member states, and we think that's going to have a really big impact just in terms of kind of mobilising activity and capital into the space. Another point we also make at Foresight is just the interaction between what we've just been talking about, theme one, energy transition, and nature, in terms of investing in nature at renewable energy sites themselves is such an important activity. It is something where we're delighted that we are collaborating with you guys, Juliet, between us and Foresight, with the nature the nature recovery blueprint, that we've put together with you guys, which is really an open source manual for all asset owners in the renewable energy space in terms of how to go about restoring nature at renewable energy sites. That in the future will be incredibly important. I think that the estimates are that somewhere between 3 and 5% of the Earth's surface will be covered with wind and solar sites by 2050. So what happens there will have a big impact on the world.
I was going to build on what Laura was saying, which is making sure that things are connected and having the pathways. It applies to nature as much as it does energy. We need to connect up our nature as well as we can, and I think there's a role for those big energy sites to enable us to do that. I don't know if Laura, you were going to comment on that.
I'm going to build on that, because when one starts to look at this energy infrastructure, particularly transmission in sensitive parts, the absolute key thing that the public want to see, and it's actually almost a license to operate, is deep nature restoration, enhancement, biodiversity. And it is, really is your license. And if you are not complying with that, and if you're not understanding in many ways the very fragile ecosystems that you're building over, you will end up coming a cropper when it comes to planning, etc. But so for example, SSE is absolutely net gain on nature and biodiversity in all its projects. But as you rightly say, Julia, it is difficult and it is challenging. And in some ways, this is all about collaborating a lot closer and not seeing infrastructure and nature almost as separate, but actually seeing how can we integrate it. You look at buildings that are actually, in many ways, nature-based buildings that have actually understood that they need to enhance the biodiversity in big cities. So you've got it in those environments too. And we do need much clearer standards to ensure that we're enhancing and not deteriorating our biodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely, Laura. It's just such an important topic, and that kind of integrated nature of energy and nature, I think, is increasingly recognised, the role that nature will play in climate adaptation as well. Green cities are just better set up to cope with what's coming in future decades. Want to move on to our third and final theme now. So we've done the two easy ones, energy transition and nature. Now the difficult one, which is how do we decarbonise beyond power? So all these other sectors, such as heat, transportation, industry, how can we drive decarbonisation there? We had a working group at the forum focus on this one, which was chaired by our own Chris Holmes. Chris, did you have any reflections on the discussion at the forum about how we can go about decarbonising these other sectors?
It was certainly a far-reaching conversation down amongst our working group, and many great ideas, but of course a very challenging sector. I think, as you suggest, it's a tricky topic, but an absolutely fundamental one to tackle. Decarbonising heat and energy-intensive industries is critical to meeting our targets, but they come with a lot of challenges around the solutions that are on offer, the applications of those, often quite granular solutions and applications for housing, for industry, and just trying to bring all that together into an investable proposition for private capital is a challenge in itself. I know, Laura, you were part of some of the discussions here, thinking about perhaps some of the regulatory models that might encourage further investment into things like energy efficiency. We've seen some encouragement to bring technologies such as heat pumps to the UK housing market with perhaps limited success. Really a complex one to tackle, and whilst we did think about some good ideas, I don't think we came up with a real sort of silver bullet for all, and perhaps that suggests that it is a pretty difficult topic in itself.
Yeah. I loved the discussion at the conference, and it was very diverse because we had quite a lot of different expertise. The very first fuel always is energy efficiency. And, I mean, I hope you don't mind, bad language on this podcast, but the UK is particularly crap at that. And we have very bad housing, and we have very, very little focus on efficiency, not just at the sort of demand side, but also within the system. There's a lot of losses. There's lots of in some ways, bad design that we do need to address. So energy efficiency, the first fuel, then transformation, then decarbonisation of the efficient plant manufacturing that you have. But there are a couple of issues here. Number one is the energy sector, and I've just been talking about this morning. The energy sector doesn't really understand customers. It doesn't really engage with people and with businesses in particular. And actually what we need to do is to create a much stronger partnership between the energy sector and the commercial and industrial sector to actually design these pathways by which people can decarbonise. And as I was saying about grid, £3.5 billion worth of commercial and industrial investment that cannot connect. So we have really got to start to take people on this electrification process. I'm going to chair an organisation called Electrify Industry, which is going to be looking at these very hard to abate. There is, of course, carbon capture and storage, which I think will play a role, but I think it will be around clusters. And I think it will be reasonably limited in terms of what we're going to do in terms of the manufacturing sector more generally. And to be frank, it is electrification. And if you look at those electric arc furnaces in South Talbot, these are routes that people are going down fundamentally. And when we start to look at heat, again, we're going to have to start to really engage with something called human beings. And this is something that, as I say, the energy sector is not so great at. But this also demands us to look at nature, because that's a very useful and important part of the trade-off. But it's also we are going to have to look at what one might call the just transition. And I think that we need pathways by which, I call them bridges from the fossil fuel world to the decarbonisation world, not ravines that we expect people to leap across and hope they don't fall between the cracks.
And I believe there's a lot of frustration in our sector about not having this joined up approach around these really what can be quite rewarding sectors to decarbonise in terms of the impact that they can have. But we keep mentioning heat. I know, Juliet, at the Eden Project, you were kind enough to show us around your nursery, which is linked up to your very own geothermal projects. But I also know that you've had your own frustrations in connections. We talked about connections earlier, and perhaps you could provide a little bit of insight and into your journey to decarbonise your own heat generation.
Well, I mean, our own heat generation is great, but our problem, as Laura said, was the grid. Our problem is the grid, so it's sharing it. It's all very well producing it for yourself, but you can't share. So but it has been. I mean, it's been transformative for us in terms of being able to create this fantastic nursery, all the products and services, and once you get that investment, you can really use that to fly. So so we invest in geothermal, then we can have a nursery, then we can have incredible sustainable plant production, which brings in another revenue stream. And so I think what's really interesting about this is that if we can crack this, if we can get down the right route, it will open doors to all sorts of things, as Laura's saying. It may be an investment in energy, but actually it's an investment in all sorts of other things that can fall out of that as well. And that's the exciting opportunity. It's just the most brilliant foundation for everything else, for a more efficient bioeconomy, for a more sustainable economy.
Can I add to this? I had a conversation with the low carbon contracts company about CFDs, contracts for difference, and the contracts. Could you miniaturize a contract for difference? And they said. Then I spoke to one of the pension funds, and they said, yeah, if we had a CFD, we would buy, let's say, £40 million worth of heat pumps. And you amortize these assets across, because one of the things that we do is if you're in an offshore wind farm, right, you get everybody bends over backwards. But when you start to look at this distributed asset base, you've got to do it all on your own. You've got to do all the heavy lifting. And for me to buy a heat pump is about the same investment ask as it is for, let's say, Ørsted to do an offshore wind farm. So why are we not understanding that actually these distributed assets will actually take pressure off the grid? It will optimize the system, but also it will give serious benefits to people like Eden Project, but lots of other businesses. So I think we look at my asset is bigger than your asset sort of problem. And actually what we need a whole set of distributed assets that are actually doing a lot of it.
Yeah, I totally agree, Laura. And I think then using that as a stepping stone to bring everything to a conclusion here, I kind of feel what you're saying there is actually we all need to get better at systems thinking. Like we need to see the role that all the components have to play in the system. That's the point about transmission. Renewable energy is not just about wind and solar. We need to build effectively a whole orchestra of different instruments, the renewables themselves, energy storage at different timescales, grid infrastructure from the very small to the very large. But we also need just the big chunky infrastructure assets, but we also need the distributed generation. And like you say, that actually is the way to decarbonise in the most efficient manner as well.
Absolutely. I love your orchestra. And actually, the energy system is much simpler than the nature system. The nature system is really, really exciting because it's very, very complicated and fascinating.
Exactly. I think there's lots of lessons we can learn from the nature system and apply that to the energy system and the broader economy. Chris, any final thoughts on closing? How do we take this forward? What's our call to action here?
Well, I think certainly we came away with a lot of great ideas, some interesting concepts from our Frontier Forum. I know we want to pull those together and start thinking about how we might want to engage with our stakeholders, with governments and other key members of our community to see how we can pull all these strings together, because there's so much to do in this space. We do need to mobilise capital at scale, as we suggested in this very title. And I'm looking forward to furthering our conversations and playing a key role of that at Foresight.
And Laura, Juliet, if you had one action you could take away now to help protect the planet, to protect us in the future, and accelerate mobilising capital into these areas, what would be your one action to take away?
Policy certainty. I think that's one of the most important things, whether it be in nature or in energy.
So, Chris, if I could do one thing, I think I would make sure that we had nature on the board of all the corporate institutions to represent nature and encourage more nature positive decision making.
I think that's such an important point, Juliet, and it was actually Bronte Ansell, representing Lawyers for Nature, who made exactly that point at the forum. And she was talking about how nature should have a voice in the room. And at that very moment, the heavens opened up and there was kind of biblical rain. So it kind of felt like nature very much did have a voice in the room there. Well, thank you very much, Juliet and Laura. That's been fantastic. We really appreciate you taking the time to wrap things up. And Chris, from my perspective, I think the key things we took away from the forum is just the need for more public-private sector collaboration, an evolution of policy, an understanding of the true kind of complexity and risk in this space, which is obviously only getting more, but there are more and more opportunities for investors to put capital to work in these incredibly important areas.
Absolutely. Very well said. And I think on that note, we'll draw this to a close. Juliet, Laura, thank you very much for your time. And no doubt we'll speak soon.
Thank you.